industrial accidents,
ancient
solving
poisoners,
crime,
poison
chemical
prevention.
spills. This is Toxic History.
Dr. Stacy Hale is an associate professor of emergency medicine and medical toxicology at UT Southwestern in Dallas and an attending physician at Parkland Hospital and the North Texas Poison Center. In this episode, she examines MK-Ultra, the CIA's Cold War-era mind control program, drawing on documented history and declassified records to explore its goals, methods, and lasting impact, while also unpacking the conspiracy narratives around it and what evidence, if any, supports them.
Today, we are going to delve into the conspiracy fact of MK-Ultra, which was the CIA's mind control program. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the conspiracy theory of Project Monarch. So join Dr. Blumenberg and me, and let's go down the rabbit hole. I will say that probably every one of my slides could have 50 more rabbit holes the more we delve into this topic. So getting into the mindset of why the CIA wanted to do mind control, it started with Operation Paperclip. And this was the operation where the CIA was basically rehoming Nazi physicians and scientists to the United States in an effort to keep their secrets away from the Soviet Union. So as a reminder, the US and the Soviet Union shared a very uneasy alliance during World War II. And then after the war, the alliance crumbled and thus began the Cold War. Because the Soviet Union embraced atheism and communism, slave labor gulags, they dissolved democratic institutions. All of these were incompatible with American values and ultimately led to the Red Scare. So during World War II, there was actually a wartime intelligence service, and it was called the OSS, which was the Office of Strategic Services. And it was established in 1942, again, during wartime. And the purpose was to coordinate intelligence and paramilitary operations during the war. Well, President Truman in 1945 decided that the US didn't need a clandestine intelligence agency during peacetime, and so he abolished the OSS. But he changed his mind in 1947 and signed the National Security Act, which basically gave birth to the CIA. And then in 1949, the CIA Act gave this unprecedented lack of oversight. And basically, there were unvouchered funds, and it was basically nothing had to be disclosed to Congress, and these employees could do whatever they wanted, basically. So not unlike the space race, there was an arms race for mind control. The CIA was actually convinced that the Soviets had perfected mind control. And one reason for this was there was a leader of the Catholic Church in Hungary named Cardinal Joseph Medzensky. And he was a very vocal critic of the communist regime, and he got arrested for treason. But under duress by the Soviets, he confessed to crimes that he did not commit. So the CIA was convinced that he was under the influence of mind control. And in retrospect, they were probably just using traditional methods of fatigue, hunger, torture, and isolation. There was something called Project Bluebird. And this was basically a predecessor to MK-Ultra. It was named for getting people to sing like a bird, and it lasted from 1951 to 1953. It explored special interrogation techniques such as hypnosis to implant ideas, false memories, electroconvulsive therapy, and then LSD and mescaline to produce vulnerable states and sensory deprivation and isolation. There was also Project Artichoke, and this was in August 20th of 1951. And the primary goal was to determine whether a person could be made to perform an act of attempted assassination or develop a Manchurian candidate. And so it used also mind control, hypnosis, forced addiction to morphine and LSD. Now, on April 10th, 1953, the director of Central Intelligence, Alan Dulles, gave a speech on brain warfare. And this is what he said. This was to the Princeton alumni. I wonder, however, whether we clearly perceive the magnitude of the problem, whether we realize how sinister the battle for men's minds has become in Soviet hands. We might call it in its new form brain warfare. Well, of course, 3 days later, MK Ultra was started. Now, MK Ultra is a cryptonym, which is what it sounds like, a cryptic name, and it's not supposed to mean anything to, in a sense that they don't want anyone to figure out what's going on behind closed doors. MK allegedly was the initials of the administrative secretary, but when I looked into it further, these were the letters given to programs that came out of a specific department in the CIA, known as the TSS, which we'll talk about. And Ultra may have been homage to the Allies' code-breaking efforts during the war, but also probably refers to ultra secretive, how ultra secretive this endeavor was. Now, MK Ultra contained 149 subprojects. Most were dangerous and deadly, and they operated under cutout groups, so nobody suspected that they were working on CIA projects at the time. And these were universities, reputable universities, and other types of organizations around the country. So Sidney Gottlieb was given command. So enter Sidney Gottlieb, the poisoner in chief. And he was born in 1918 in the Bronx to Jewish immigrants, very humble beginnings. And he ultimately ended up getting a PhD in chemistry from Caltech, and he joined the CIA in 1951. So he was appointed head of what was called the Technical Services Staff, TSS. And that's where any projects that came out of the TSS were labeled with the MK, because there were other projects that had MK too. So he oversaw MK Ultra, and he was tasked with figuring out how to achieve mind control, but he wasn't sure how to get started. So he started looking around and he looked into LSD. So LSD was synthesized by Albert Hofmann in 1938, and it was actually the version LSD 25. And he was hoping that Sandoz, which was the pharmaceutical company, would take interest, but they didn't, so he shelved it. But then in 1943, he resynthesized it, and 20 micrograms hit his skin, and he felt unusual sensations and rode his bike home in a dreamlike state with fantastic pictures. So that's where the famous Albert Hofmann on the bike comes from. Then there was something else that happened, and this was in 1951 in Pont Saint-Esprit, France. There were dozens of residents that started having these nightmarish hallucinations. One man jumped into a river because snakes were eating him. Another told a doctor his heart was outside his chest. And others were dancing naked in the town square. And then ultimately 5 people died. Well, since this is a webinar with toxicologists, you probably can suspect that this was from ergot, and of course the contamination from the rye. Well, this incident caught the CIA's attention, and they were like, what if the Soviets released ergot into our water supply in a coordinated fashion? So the CIA obtained LSD, because we all know that LSD is similar to ergot, and so they got this LSD from Sandoz and started using it in covert operations. So to review all the factors that led to Project MK Ultra: the Cold War and tensions with the Soviet Union, their belief that Soviet Union had mind control, the use of LSD and its discovery, and then the ergot incident in France, all is what culminated in the development of MK Ultra. So how it started? Well, the CIA scientists would pull pranks on each other. So I'm trying to imagine, here they are at the CIA, and they would put LSD in the office coffee pot, or they were spiking drinks and watching the reaction, okay? Like some office party. And it was so bad that the CIA's Office of Security had to issue a warning that it would discipline anyone who tried to put LSD in the holiday punch bowl. On top of everything, because they felt like if you were going to poison somebody, you needed to do it secretly. So they recruited magician John Mulholland. He was actually trained under Houdini, and he taught all the CIA agents the art of deception and put it into these training manuals. And what's funny is these magic manuals of Langley were missing until 2007. And the one that remains and was found and is one of the few completely intact documents from MK Ultra is some operational applications of the art of deception. Then there was the Frank Olson incident. Now, Frank Olson was a U.S. Army biological warfare scientist at Camp Detrick and then Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. And he worked with ex-Nazis who had been brought into the U.S. under Operation Paperclip. So here's the Frank Olson incident. And if any of you have ever watched Wormwood, it's a limited docuseries on Netflix. It's only like 3 or 4 episodes. It's really good. But here's what happened. So in November of 1953, and this is like a week before Thanksgiving, Frank Olson, Gottlieb, and then a Dr. Robert Lashbrook all went to the CIA retreat in Maryland, and it was called the Deep Creek Lake Retreat. And here's where they would just talk about their scientific experiments, and it was supposed to instill camaraderie amongst them. But without his knowledge, Gottlieb and Lashbrook spiked his drink with LSD, and he suffered an intense psychological reaction. He ran out into the woods. He was having a very, very difficult time. So they're like, oh no, we've got to fix this because he knows too many secrets. So they took him to a Dr. Harold Abramson, who's a bad dude, okay? And this was a psychiatrist in New York who was recruited also by the CIA and a physician as part of MK Ultra. And he would dose Olson with Nembutal to essentially kept him under CIA control. Well, on November 28th, 1953, Olson fell or jumped. And that's what are the words that go through history is what actually happened. But he actually went through the window, including the blinds at the Statler Hotel in Manhattan. There is also something called Operation Midnight Climax, which from that name, you might discern what was going on. This is started by Gottlieb in the 1950s. It was run by this guy named George White, who had sexual problems. And he was a Federal Bureau of Narcotics officer who was secretly working for the CIA. And what they ultimately did was they set up safe houses, which they were nothing but safe. They were essentially disguised as brothels. And White would sit behind these two-way mirrors on a portable toilet and watch prostitutes lure men in and dose them with LSD and watch them have sex to determine if giving LSD to like a honeypot spy would help these men spill secrets behind enemy lines. And they would just sit and watch. And then also Gottlieb and White would engage in sexual behavior as well. So this was our tax dollars at work. Here's a guy named Dr. Ewan Cameron, who was also recruited to be part of MK Ultra. And this was at the Allen Memorial Institute of Psychiatry in Montreal, Canada. You can just look at this place and say that spooky things were probably happening here. But he took things to the next level. He received funding from the CIA and started doing something called psychic driving, where he would put people in a drugged state with LSD or other drugs, and then play these repetitive recorded messages over and over and over again, like your mother hates you, your mother hates you, your mother hates you. This would drive people nuts. The people were coming here with low levels of depression and anxiety, and this was his treatment. But all the while, they were unwitting subjects to experimentation, and he was hoping to depattern or erase their existing personality. Then there were the lawsuits associated with the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, where prisoners, as part of MK Ultra experimentation, were given LSD and other substances without formed consent. And they were used in behavioral modification studies, interrogation techniques, and it wasn't until survivors years later realized what had happened and sued the federal government. So I want to point out that the poisoner-in-chief, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, certainly was coming up with ways to assassinate foreign adversaries by poisoning them, like Fidel Castro and one of the ministers of the Congo. But we're talking about something a lot more sinister. These mind control programs were more sinister than just poisoning. They combined the use of drugs like LSD with hypnosis and sensory deprivation and trauma to wipe the mind clean and open it to reprogramming. They included threats and coercion and imprisonment, isolation, deprivation, humiliation, torture, brainwashing, something called black psychiatry and hypnosis with chemical agents, and an effort to basically, it's kind of like hitting the factory restore settings on your iPhone. So as time went on, MK Ultra was on its last legs. Gottlieb apparently never found an effective truth drug, and over its lifespan, they spent $10 million at 80 different institutions, prisons, hospitals, research institutes, but they apparently never were able to achieve mind control. And the CIA director at the time decided to shut it down. Well, I think what happened was there was going to be a bunch of congressional oversight of MK Ultra, and they didn't want their secrets to come out, so they just decided to quote unquote shut it down because public outrage would have made it impossible for the CIA to ever resume such a program. Well, openly, that is. So enter Project Monarch. So some would say that MK Ultra continued, but under undisclosed names such as Project Monarch. And when you start looking for this, you can't unsee it in all of our popular culture, specifically in the music industry. It's widely viewed as a conspiracy theory with no credible evidence that it existed or exists as a formal CIA program. But it's based on this concept, which is what MK Ultra was about, trauma-based mind control, to basically create these programmable people on command, such as a Manchurian candidate or obedient slaves or sex kittens. And they use trauma and fear and drugs to destroy the old self. The old self dies, and then they rebuild the psyche. So, of course, this is what Sidney Gottlieb was trying to achieve with MK Ultra. So when a person is undergoing this kind of trauma, such as by an electroshock, they feel lightheaded, as if they're floating like a butterfly. But there's also this symbolic transformation or metamorphosis from a caterpillar to a butterfly. And they try to split personalities into what are programmable alters and triggers where they can be controlled remotely or triggered with simple commands by a handler. So let's have fun and explore this conspiracy theory as possible conspiracy fact. There was continuity from MK Ultra because it did splinter in so many sub-programs. And then the plausibility of secret sub-projects that the intelligence community always said never existed. But some of them, like MK Ultra and Operation Mockingbird, were conspiracies until they were proved real. There are survivor testimonies. Some of course, have been discredited. And then this butterfly symbolism and leaks into media are too widespread to be a coincidence. I urge you all to go watch Katy Perry's Wide Awake music video. You can see the caterpillar. Here she is in this type of state in a wheelchair, and then she emerges with a completely different butterfly personality, and the butterfly symbolism is there. Brick by Boring Brick by Paramore. You've got to watch these music videos with this newfound thought process. And then Britney Spears, Born to Make You Happy. Again, the butterflies. And once you start looking for it, this is everywhere, everywhere. And I've just given a few examples, but I could have kept going. And so what I say is, you decide. Coincidence?